Tell me your dreams, make them as big as you can, so then they have the best chance of maybe working out. Sometimes nothing works out, sometimes don't be alarmed. Don't shy away when you're in the wrong. I can testify to what it's like being lost inside yourself, a personal hell. But I want to live to the second last day that my children do, selfishly so I can see them through and all that they become. That's all I'll ever become. So spend it all, every last bit that you have. If you need to buy back the piece you lost to the upkeep, renting a room for your soul, I can see how every last downfall of man could one day lead to the end if we can't find harmony and treat others like we'd like to be treated fair. I know it's not really fair. That don't mean that the outcome should be decided solely by the income of people who don't need it for living still. I want to live to the second last day that my children do, selfishly so I can see them through and all that they become. That's all I'll ever 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 become.
What an awesome video. We can go ahead and get started. Next slide. Emily, if you don't mind, pick it up.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to our beautiful and brilliant community of practice. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, and also please feel free to use the chat throughout the hour. You will receive a link within the week to this echo recording, and please feel free to share that too if you have to leave early. Next slide. Okay. We are offering continuing education credits. We do this jointly with Cardia Services. In order to receive the units, which we are offering in either medical, nursing, or social work credit hours, you need to complete the evaluation. I'll share the link throughout the hour. You also have to complete attendance of attend the full session, and you can also claim continuing education units if you watch the recording. I will share that link throughout. Also, even if you aren't looking for education units, you can still fill out the survey and give us feedback. We always like feedback. And there are no relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies for those involved with the ability to control the content of this activity. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Welcome. Mitakue Oyase. I am Bernice Jordan. I am a citizen of the Fort Peck Sioux Nation. I am one of the program managers here at USET. Next slide. So we want to acknowledge what tribal nation that you are currently on. So if you would go into this website or text your zip code to this number, it'll actually show you what tribal nation you're located on. Next slide. So I want to introduce Holly Echo Hawk. She'll be taking over from here on out to do our introductions. Holly, this is yours.
Hi, everybody. Glad to see you. Thank you for joining us again for another session of Reclaiming Native Psychological Brilliance. And of course, we just saw Brilliance with William Prince and his song and his lyrics. I love to listen to him. And thank you for choosing that song. So today, big treat, Dr. Juliana Reese, tribal physician, and thank goodness for tribal physicians. I don't know if I just want to take a moment and appreciate you, Dr. Reese, because it's not an easy thing to become a medical doctor. It's a lot of sacrifice, a lot of time away from your family, probably many, many years to become a medical doctor, a physician. And we just applaud you for sticking with it. And you've been a physician for quite a while, but I just think back what it must have been like to be a student, and back in the, and there was not that many Native physicians. So thank you and for sticking with it and serving the Native people. So Dr. Reese is going to introduce herself, but she has had a long-standing role as leadership in the clinical role with Indian Health Service. She's now with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Most people know that as the CDC. And with that, I welcome warmly Dr. Reese, and everyone's gonna really enjoy her presentation, and we'll let her introduce herself and take it away, Dr. Reese.
Gosh, thank you, Holly, so much. And thank all of you for hosting this. It's a brilliant, wonderful series that I get on as often as I'm able. So thank you all for the invitation. I'm really honored to be able to share some of my experience and just work collectively with you all to build health and wellness in our communities wherever we are. So let me just quickly start with the next slide. I want to do a brief introduction in Navajo. Yat ebene, Juliana Rishinisha, Kaban Nishle, Sanhabitli Bashichin, Kia Ani Edashiche, Do Oshihi Edashanella, Tell Soden, De Nasha, Akot A, Sananishla. So good morning or afternoon, wherever you all are calling in from. I'm Juliana Reese. I'm originally from Fort Defiance, Arizona, a small town on the Navajo Nation. I'm Danae, and growing up on the reservation, I was really fortunate to be able to witness or be heavily immersed in language, Navajo culture, and traditional ways. And although I witnessed a lot of the beauty and richness of my culture, I also experienced the very real challenges of being American Indian in this society. I've had a long, wonderful career serving American Indian and Alaska Native people as a primary care physician, as Holly mentioned, administrator, a mentor in tribal, private, and federal healthcare facilities. But my current position with the CDC has really allowed me to culminate my skills clinically, my public health skills, my tribal experience, and my life experience to improve overall health and well-being of American Indian and Alaska Native people. Today, I'll share a bit about my journey and how it has led me to my work in CDC and Healthy Tribes. And I'll showcase our innovative, culturally driven approach used to address social determinants of health by using the power of culture, of community, and of connectedness to ultimately advance our efforts towards health equity. Next slide. I have nothing to disclose, no financial conflicts. Next slide. The objectives for this talk will include to describe the unique characteristics of tribal public health, and there are definitely some unique aspects of working in tribal public health that are really critical for you all to understand. To demonstrate the link between social determinants of health, historical trauma, intergenerational, multi-generational trauma, stress, and chronic disease disparities in American Indian, Alaska Native populations. I know that was a mouthful, but it's surprising to me how little this link is discussed in the medical literature and the medical community. And so very important for us to establish that. I'll also give an overview of CDC's Healthy Tribes framework for improving health and wellness in American Indian, Alaska Native communities. And last, but definitely not least, I will define the concept of cultural connectedness as a means of resilience. Next slide. So as many of you are aware, American Indian, Alaska Native people have a long, complicated relationship with the US federal government. Since the formation of the Union, Indian tribes have been recognized by the United States as independent sovereign nations that have the inherent right to govern themselves. This designation has resulted in the transfer of land under treaties, contributing to the foundation of the federal Indian relationship. Federal programs and services that benefit American Indian, Alaska Natives are based on this unique government-to-government relationship that is political and legal and not race-based like other racial or ethnic groups in America. And that's a key point. And that has some importance in the latest SCOTUS decision on affirmative action, by the way, but we won't go into that here. Tribal sovereignty impacts all parts of healthcare for tribal communities, particularly the clinical service that's provided, coverage of in-house and referred services, data sharing, and much more. The government-to-government obligation is critical to understanding the unique public health challenges faced by tribes. Next slide. Currently, there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States with immense diversity in language, customs, dress, governments, and belief systems. There are, of course, far more than 574 tribes in existence, but only the federally recognized tribes are eligible for federal services, programs, and funding allocated through the federal government in response to this trust relationship that has been established. And not many people actually understand that. Although the federal government determines which tribes are recognized, the tribes themselves determine their membership. Tribal eligibility and enrollment are typically determined by blood quantum and/or descendants. DNA testing is typically not used to determine eligibility. And lastly, the public health capacity and infrastructure can range from minimal to extensive depending on the tribe. Next slide. There have been a number of distinct acts, policies, and laws enacted throughout history that have had devastating impacts on American Indian and Alaska Native communities. I show this slide as a brief overview of some of the more significant ones. Coming from a federal agency, it's imperative that this history be acknowledged as it plays a significant role in the health and wellness and healing of American Indian, Alaska Native populations and surrounding communities. I deliberately include the next few slides, not only for awareness and acknowledgement, but also so we can start to be a part of the solution. I won't go into each of these due to time today, but I'll say that it is important to recognize a common theme focused on land acquisition and cultural erasure. Next slide. Between 1953 and 1964, and I'm skipping down to the bottom of my last slide, not going through all of the early acts, but just wanted to add this slide here. The government terminated recognition of more than 100 tribes and bands as sovereign nations. In 1958, a companion policy of relocation moved Indians off reservations into urban areas, breaking family units, cultural ties, and familiar ways of life. 50% returned home to their families and reservations within 5 years because of a lack of job opportunities, education, and social services that were promised. My mother, in fact, was sent to Chicago as a teenager through the Relocation Act, witnessing horrific events. She somehow escaped back and found her way back to the reservation, reported incidences of homeless, poverty, substance use, sex trafficking, mental illness, violence, trauma, and death. The incidence of these issues were staggering and was actually reintroduced back to American Indian, Alaska Native communities and perpetuated. Many American Indian, Alaska Natives stayed in the cities, creating the roots of the American Indian movement. Just to add a positive note to that slide. Next slide. Although historical trauma for American Indian, Alaska Natives can be traced back hundreds of years to the onset of colonization, long before even the formation of the Union, it's often discredited as events in the distant past with minimal to no impact on current and future generations. Despite historical evidence of distant trauma, Much of this trauma is quite recent and continues in both blatant and subtle forms through institutional and systemic processes that continue to promote inequity. We can all imagine what life was like for our ancestors, but many of you do not need to look far to know these atrocities. Multiple members of my family, including my parents and grandparents, were boarding school survivors. They were beaten for speaking Navajo, praying, singing songs, or seeking any type of comfort and peace through cultural practice. The link between historical trauma and the disproportionate health disparities we see today in American Indian, Alaska Native communities is evident, but the impact does not end here. Next slide. You are likely familiar with the ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences Scoring System, that tabulates the number of adverse childhood experiences and correlates them to life expectancy. Multiple studies have shown that American Indian, Alaska Native show disproportionately higher scores by the age of 18 than the general population, linking health disparities, including early death, to American Indian, Alaska Native populations. Next slide. This slide integrates adverse childhood experiences with adverse community environments, demonstrating how both set the stage for health outcomes. Essentially, this is a depiction of the social determinants of health and the impact of the environment, showing how the roots directly affect the growth and development of the entire tree. For American Indian, Alaska Native communities, some of these examples include lack of access to potable water, multi-generational housing or lack of housing, lack of electricity, broadband, heating and plumbing, and transportation. Additionally, the siting of polluting industries on or near Indian country is common. The proportion of our population that is incarcerated in high-level facilities due to the structure of our judicial systems disenfranchises our relatives from voting, participating in family events, and being part of our healing communities. And the list goes on. For clinical care, it's even more complex due to the existing healthcare systems that have been historically under-resourced and underfunded. These factors amplify the barriers for American Indian and Alaska Native people. Next slide, please. We've talked a bit about ACEs, but I like to also mention another evidence-based scale that looks at positive or strength-based indicators to predict well-being and quality of life. The Benevolent Childhood Experience, or BCE scale. With American Indian, Alaska Native kids, you often wonder how some kids seem to do well while others just did not, despite very similar life circumstances. This scale helps explain the things that, if present, may contribute to resilience despite unfortunate circumstances. It gives us insight to where the strengths lie and where we need to focus to rebuild and reclaim our connections. Next slide, please. You all have probably seen this slide from one of our esteemed colleagues, Dr. Don Warren and his team. I like this slide because it not only incorporates historical trauma into the paradigm, but includes stress at gestational, childhood, and adulthood periods of life. We know adverse childhood experiences are a strong predictor of risk for numerous chronic and behavioral health conditions, including heart disease, diabetes, cancer, depression, suicide attempts, and tobacco or substance use. We don't often hear about the adulthood stress impacts. Next slide. You've likely heard a lot about the types of stress, but for brevity, I'll focus on the third one, the toxic stress. Toxic stress response can happen when a child or an adult experiences severe, recurrent, or prolonged adversity, like caregiver substance use disorder or mental illness, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, chronic neglect, exposure to violence, and or accumulated toll of family poverty without sufficient support. This prolonged activation of the body's stress response systems can disrupt the development of the brain and other organ systems, resulting in the increased risk of stress-related disease and cognitive impairment that can even be passed down in our DNA. When I think about my clinical practice, I spent much time talking to patients about trauma and the impact of stress on the body. In fact, I probably spent more time talking about that than their actual medical conditions, because the treatment plan is pretty set with the Western medical model. I already knew before the patient got there essentially what I was going to prescribe next, or what my next steps would be. What I felt was important was to talk to patients about what was happening to them in their lives and help them connect this whole idea of stress and historical intergenerational trauma, multi-generational trauma, to their chronic disease. The most consistently reported symptom was stress, financial stress, food insecurity, employment, feelings of inadequacy and hopelessness. I had patients come in apologetic about their weight, their blood pressure, their blood sugar, despite working extremely hard to change their lifestyles and take their medications. And this was adding more stress. People are abusing substances, drugs, alcohol, commercial tobacco, even food to cope with what they didn't understand and how deeply this was rooted. Patients would often miss appointments or never seek care due to feelings of shame and guilt about having a chronic disease like diabetes, obesity, or even substance use. People often felt that they somehow got diabetes because they were Indian or because some lifestyle choices they had made, like it was their fault. And the medical system perpetuates this by using a medical model that does not consider trauma or toxic stress. In fact, there's a tremendous amount of research on the health impacts of stress, yet this is not something that is talked about in medical training. Now, the good news is that the body, through all of this trauma, resets itself to kind of find some sort of balance in that situation. But it can reset itself in either direction, both in a positive direction and in a negative direction. It all depends on what's happening with your stress response in your environment. Of course, the most promising change can happen in utero and in the developing brains of our youth, but this does not mean all is lost for our adult population. This is our way to start reclaiming our health by changing our environments and providing support through culture, connection, and community. Next slide, please. I'd like to segue a bit to just review briefly some current statistics on Indian country. This slide shows just a snapshot of a few. In general, you can pick a health disparity across the board, and the likelihood that American Indian and Alaska Native will have the worst statistics proportionally is quite high. Take life expectancy at birth. It is 10.9 years less than all US races. In fact, in 2021, life expectancy for American Indians and Alaska Natives dropped to 65.2. This represents the greatest decline we've had in decades. Violent deaths, intentional injuries, homicide, and suicide accounted for 80% of all mortality for American Indians and Alaska Natives aged 15 to 24. That's a young generation, 80% of all mortality. From 2019 to 2020, there was a 27% increase in firearm homicides and a 41.8% increase in firearm suicides for American Indians. American Indians have had the highest poverty rate of any racial ethnic group, currently at 21.4 versus 12.7 all other races. Next slide, please. Mental health statistics are just as staggering, if not more. Despite these data, I won't go into them individually, but I do want to also highlight that American Indian Alaska Natives have the highest rates of alcohol abstinence compared to other races. This is important to note because despite all these health disparities, we have strong resilience factors that help us to survive. Next slide, please. So what do we do with all this? How do we go about making an impact in these health disparities? According to the County Health Rankings model, providing clinical care only contributes to about 20% of health outcomes. Social and economic factors, health behaviors, and physical environment make up the remaining 80%. An overwhelming majority of funding in our nation and attention An overwhelming majority of funding and attention in this country is focused on the clinical aspects of care, that 20%. The CDC understands the complexity of this multifactorial picture and focuses on advancing health equity through addressing the 80%, the social determinants. Next slide, please. We all know that social determinants of health influence the opportunities available to us to practice healthy behaviors, enhancing or limiting our ability to live healthy lives, and are shaped by the distribution of money, power, and resources at global, national, and local levels, and ultimately determine life expectancy, morbidity, health status, functional ability, and mental health. We also know that social determinants of health contribute to the stark, persistent chronic disease disparities we see in American Indian and Alaska Native communities. And these don't even account for historical trauma. Next slide, please. This brings me to what we do at CDC, specifically with the Healthy Tribes program. The Healthy Tribes program includes a portfolio that funds tribes, tribal organizations, and urban Indian organizations and tribal epidemiology centers through 3 cooperative agreements. The first is the Tribal Epidemiology Center Public Health Infrastructure, or TECFI. The second, Good Health and Wellness in Indian Country, or GWIC. And the final, Tribal Practices for Wellness in Indian Country, or TIPWIC. These cooperative agreements work synergistically to build upon and inform strategies to improve health outcomes across Indian Country by strengthening public health infrastructure, expanding the evidence base, and learning from innovative practices, including cultural traditions and tribal practices. The Healthy Tribes framework focuses on being strength-based, community-led, and culturally driven. Next slide, please. Before I talk about our first cooperative agreement, I want to delineate the difference between a Tribal Epidemiology Center, or TEC, and our program, TECFI. The TECs are tribally managed public health organizations that were established by and receive core funding from the Indian Health Service. They serve tribal communities by providing enhanced epidemiologic and public health services, including surveillance, public health research, and evaluation of programs to the tribes they serve. An important note is that the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act designated TECs as public health authorities. This role allows TECs to have access to data, including protected health information held by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for various public health activities. This is a map of the 12 regions that TEC centers support. Next slide. Now for TECFI, or the Tribal Epidemiology Center Public Health Infrastructure Cooperative Agreement, TECFI was launched in 2017 to support the TECs. The purpose of TECFI is to strengthen the TEC's public health capacity to meet national public health accreditation standards and deliver the 10 essential public health services. They also strengthen public health capacity of tribes and urban Indian organizations as the TEC and the TECs that they serve. TECFI activities include developing and expanding data sharing agreements, which allow TECs to support and guide COVID-19 responses in tribal and urban communities throughout the pandemic. Next slide, please. Our next program is GWIC, Good Health and Wellness in Indian Country. GWIC was launched in 2014 as is CDC's largest ever investment in American Indian Alaska Native communities. GWIC supports a coordinated, holistic approach to chronic disease prevention through community-chosen, culturally adapted policies, systems, and environmental improvements to achieve long-term goals of reducing rates of death, disability from commercial tobacco use, diabetes, heart disease, and stroke, and reducing the prevalence of obesity. Through GWIC, recipients are implementing culturally adapted interventions, including food sovereignty programs, training community health representatives, and implementing CDC's National Diabetes Prevention Program. We are in our second cycle of GWIC and are continuing to learn from the community how this program is meeting the needs, supporting strengths to better fit tribal communities as they work to address chronic disease. Next slide. The third and final cooperative agreement in the Healthy Tribes portfolio is the Tribal Practices for Wellness in Indian Country, or TIPWIC. And I'm really excited about TIPWIC. It is an innovative, groundbreaking program, really the first of its kind to be supported at CDC. We all know that American Indian and Alaska Native people have been using tribal practices as a way of life, unity, connection, strength, and survival for thousands of years. These cultural practices are deep-rooted forms of resilience, and with these teachings come balance, health, and wellness for the individual, community, and all living things, including the earth. TIPWIC focuses on rebuilding resilience in a culturally appropriate way, using a community cultural component that encourages and supports tribal practices that build resilience and connections to community, family, and culture. The aim of TIPWIC is to support and identify these cultural protective factors that reduce risk factors for chronic disease and promote wellness among American Indian Alaska Native people. Next slide. TIPWIC was intentionally designed to specifically address one social determinant of health, social connectedness. We found strong, consistent themes surrounding social and emotional well-being, but this seemed to be more specifically tied to culture. Out of this work, the concept of cultural connectedness was established as a component of social connectedness. Social connectedness includes strengthening one's sense or identity by connecting one to traditions, improving one's well-being by building a sense of belonging to a tribal community, and achieving improved health through strengthening resilience against challenges of life. Cultural practices are essential determinants of health that impact the well-being and health in living and healthy living in Native communities. The work done through TIPWIC serves to establish scientific credibility for what Indigenous populations have already known, that culture is medicine, that culture is wellness. Next slide, please. This is just a map of the current recipients of TIPWIC right now across the country, and some pictures of our recipients doing a lot of the fantastic work that they've been involved in. Next slide. Let me just have a quick time check. Am I doing okay on time so far? This brings me, this slide, to just a brief look at my childhood through college, medical school, and finally my public health practice. I'm often asked, how is it that you're able to, that you have been able to get to where you are given the challenges and obstacles that most face growing up on the reservation? This is a really difficult question to answer. At least it had always been a really difficult question to answer until I started engaging in the work that I do through CDC. I mean, of course, first of all, I didn't do any of this alone. Much of it was very hard work, perseverance, and even luck. But I've also come to understand that my journey was paved by family, community, and cultural connections, all contributing to my resilience, because this journey has not been without failure. It has continually required me to draw from strength instilled in me through my upbringing, to persevere, to be brave, curious, and willing to constantly learn, and to be innovative and believe you can do whatever you put your mind to. My hopes are that you'll make a connection between what I've learned on my journey and what we do in Healthy Tribes, but also to take from some lessons learned to recognize your strengths, to tell your stories, to support the power of culture in wellness. Next slide, please. Now, this slide is a slide of my family. I show you these pictures to give you a glimpse of the resilience factors that they had passed down despite tremendous challenges throughout time. The black and white picture at the upper left is taken sometime in the 50s. It's of a few members of my paternal side, the Tsenha-Bithni and Ushihi, or Sleeping Rock and Salt People clans. Most of them are gone now, but the love and humor and lessons live on. My grandfather, Patty, was well known as a rancher, farmer, businessman, community leader, and medicine man, but he was actually most famous for discovering uranium in our family land near Grants, New Mexico. My father and grandfather were very skilled at making connections and doing business in an area of very diverse culture. They were both multilingual, speaking Navajo and Spanish fluently, as well as Laguna, Acoma, Apache, and English. In a time when Indians were not allowed to enter bars or certain public spaces where all the business deals were made, their keen negotiating skills, sharp wit, and intimidating presence helped them to navigate more successfully. I'm going to abbreviate my talk here just a bit. Looking underneath that picture, you see a picture of three matriarchs of my maternal line, the Tkapaha line. My grandmother, oh, I'm sorry, let me start over. They carry their strong matrilineal lineage of Tkapaha or Water's Edge clan. In Navajo, all of these women are considered my grandmothers, including the grandma who birthed my mother and was a medicine woman skilled in Navajo and Native American church ways. The sister that raised her, who despite working decades for the Catholic Church, practiced strictly traditional Navajo ways with my grandfather. And the sister who was a devout Mormon and required me to refer to her not as grandma, but as grand aunt, as she cooked traditional foods, spoke fluent Navajo, used corn pollen and cedar, and always wore turquoise and nail polish. Neither one of my parents graduated high school, but both were successful in their own right. My mom got her GED and became the accounting supervisor for the Navajo Nation. My dad was a very renowned cowboy in the rodeo world, as well as a businessman and a stock contractor. Although both sides of my family were very culturally intact, they could not have been any different. As you can see, I came from a home filled with contrasting experiences, a mix of unpredictability and stability, of fear and security, of impulsivity and meticulous control, of calm and elation, of tragedy and joy. There's always an expectation of courage, toughness, efficiency, excellence, and perseverance. It was more acceptable to express anger than to show tears. You were required to show respect for all things. There were strict rules, yet fierce expectation to break boundaries, challenge authority, and see life as limitless. Humor was pervasive, and despite failure and tragedy, things tended to work out. He always got back on the horse, so to speak. Through all this, I always knew I was loved and cherished. I was surrounded by family that reinforced this. I see now, sorry, my screen is jumping here.
Can, Dr. Reese, can I
You can.
interrupt you just for a second? This is such a great example of Native brilliance. Your family, all the languages they spoke, their strategic negotiations, their, the way that they cared for each other, just the multi-layers of skills and knowledge and brilliance. This is a perfect example of what we talk about in this series, that Native people may communicate differently, and that often gets misunderstood as not as intelligent, when in fact they're usually the sharpest cookie in the room. And I think your family is a great example of that. And you're doing great on time.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Yeah, it's really amazing to see how different both sides were. My grandma's side was very calm and deliberate. My father's side was very adventurous and kind of in your face, but both very culturally intact. And yeah, we got a mix of values and ethics that were passed down, and it really forced us as children to kind of figure out the balance between that and come up with our own way. So that was powerful. Go to my next slide here. So this slide is a compilation of traditional events, from healing ceremonies to first laugh parties. That's my son in the center at his first laugh celebration. There's a puberty ceremonies, my daughter up the upper right, and my niece at the upper left. There's also a picture of my wedding on the bottom right. These are just a few examples of cultural events that I participated in that bring the community together and celebrate life, lineage, and healing. It wasn't until quite later in my life that I realized that much of the way I was raised on both sides stemmed from hard life experience family had endured, from intergenerational, multi-generational, and historical trauma, but that they were also grounded by deep-rooted cultural values that prompted my family to prepare me for the difficulties ahead. I always thought I grew up in a kind of a tough love environment, but now I understand where a lot of that came from. Throughout my life, I saw so many that confused trauma with our culture, abandoning anything Navajo just to escape. I was so fortunate to have family and community connections because they're necessary to be able to embrace our culture, to relearn it, to teach it, and to pass it on. My family constantly reinforced culture as power, culture as protection, and culture as healing. Not only were my parents and grandparents getting me ready for life's challenges, but they were also instilling and nurturing the protective factors for resilience that have been passed down from my family, my community, and my ancestors. Trauma responses exhibit themselves in many ways, but so does the power of our culture. I grew up in a world that many seen as quite disadvantaged in ways, yet there were examples all around me of strength, love, resilience, and the will to find balance and fairness in it all. Next slide. So this brings me to what really led me to medicine and public health. I know it was a natural path for me, stemming also from my Navajo cultural values. In Navajo, the concept of Hajo is at the center of all that we continually strive for in life. Hajo can be defined as balance, harmony, beauty, or even peace. This concept in many ways parallels the notion of equity. Equity and fairness are foundational elements at the heart of both medicine and public health. Over time, I've realized that more and more that this is what drives my passion. I've had the honor and privilege of serving American Indian Alaska Native patients in many capacities, drawing from the lessons I've learned as I go. I continue to bring this knowledge, my life experience, and my story to the work that I do at CDC, promoting innovative ways to approach health and wellness and supporting Indigenous ways of knowing in this prestigious world of Western science. It's often difficult to live and work in what seems to be two worlds, but to be successful, we need to draw from the knowledge that we already have to design a framework for rebuilding our communities, supporting resilience, and reclaiming our health. You all have likely heard of the Indigenous concept, cultural perpetuity, that states the knowledge and wisdom of a community can live on in perpetuity so long as the members of that community continue to practice and pass down that knowledge. This means we all have a role. Our stories are powerful and contribute to the cultural perpetuity of our people wherever we are, and despite what little knowledge we think we may have compared to our parents and grandparents. My hope is that you'll gain knowledge, inspiration, and some ancestral energy to tell your truth, to build your framework, to support your community, and to reclaim your health. Next slide. I'd like to end with this slide because it seems to epitomize our Healthy Tribes approach. Nothing about us without us is for us. We all need to keep this in mind as we tap into the power of community, culture, and connection to advance health equity in any community we serve. As we build and honor our responsibility of passing on our knowledge, we know each generation has had it just a little bit easier than the one before in many ways. What my great-grandmother experienced was much more horrific than what my grandmother lived. And what we experienced was likely less traumatic than what our parents experienced. In addition, the ramifications for speaking out and instituting change were much harsher, often fatal for our ancestors, our great-grandparents, and our parents. As we stand on the shoulders of all those before us, we must remember that our ancestors, our grandparents, and parents left us with far more than scars. Thank you. Okay.
Well, I told you all you were in for a treat. Dr. Reese, that was incredible. And I wanted to go back to two things before we turn it over to Livia for the reflections. And I also see that people want to hear about one of the ceremonies. But the two things I want to go back to for a couple of minutes here is the benevolent childhood experiences that was on slide number 12. And you all will receive a copy of all of this, all the participants on the call and those who registered and who weren't able to attend today. But I really love the BCE, Benevolent Childhood Experiences tool, because it most screens and tools like that are negative. Thank you, Brian. But this one is so important to have a strength-based tool. And I know Dr. Reese and I were talking a few days ago about, and people sometimes ask if in a family, let's say, there's some really rough experiences that the family might have gone through. And if you think about siblings in that family, one sibling is able to come through that process and that duress and continue to do well. Another sibling may not, same family perhaps, but not do as well, be more susceptible to substance use and other challenges. And I think you were saying that, if I remember correctly, so please correct me, Dr. Reese, that some of that capacity to be resilient and be able to kind of settle with the negative experiences that might have happened, go back to the benevolent childhood experiences. Is that correct in your?
Absolutely. There's been a lot of research in this area, and it's really interesting. A lot of programs that have been developed even outside of Indian country talk about childhood experiences being blunted by at least having one supportive adult as a child. And so that is kind of something that that's been discussed outside of Indian country. But when you look at Indian country, we're community based. We have all this within our reach in the structure of how we build our communities and how we live. And I just love this slide because it talks about beliefs that gave you comfort. So I bring that one up because my mom was adopted and was essentially adopted by her biological mother's sister, and raised as an only child for a long time, and really had a number of challenging experiences. But she always that one indicator, I think, makes a huge difference, because it doesn't matter what environment you are. You could be in prison, you could be you know, in the military, you could be at school, you could be wherever. And if you have a belief that gives you comfort, that alone can provide resilience and strength. And so these things aren't talked about and aren't acknowledged as sources of power, really, enough. And so kids may be in the same family and have access to some of this, and one just doesn't realize it as much as the other, or for certain circumstances, it's not accessible to that particular child. But if this can be something that can be promoted in communities, so that even the neighbor could be a part of the resilience of that child. And that's kind of how we build our communities. So
Right.
I hope I answered your question.
You
I
did.
said a
Thank
lot
you.
more than.
And it could be the difference in siblings might be due to their developmental age at the time. But this is a fabulous, I just want to bring everybody's attention back to this scale, the Benevolent Childhood Experiences Scale. And I hope you all look at it and the audience looks at it and thinks about adding it to your tools that you use. The second thing I just want to mention and go back to is, I think it was slide 17, which is your comment about improving Native health status, and that primary care is only 20% of what contributes to improving Native health status. So our audience are people who work in behavioral health or in the substance use treatment or mental health. So no, it wasn't that one. It was the one that had I may
The
not.
county rankings, how do we improve the health status?
That
Yes.
one. Yeah, thank you. That's it.
I
So my
find
point
this.
is the 80%, the cumulative 80% below are all the factors that can improve Native health status, and healthy behaviors, which is our field, is 30%. So I guess I think that was just really interesting, that we can make a tremendous difference in the health status of Native people by the work that we do, in partnership, of course, with primary health care. But I think that was really interesting that clinical care, and I interpret it as medical care, primary health care is really only 20% of what improves health status of tribal people, and healthy behaviors, socioeconomic factors, which goes to our tribal government decisions, and physical environment, which also goes to our tribal government decisions, are the other factors that have a bigger boost on health status. So thank you for sharing this information.
And 80% of the funding, or more in some states, depending on what state you're talking about, actually go to clinical care. And people are sort of missing the boat there. There's just so much opportunity to make an impact. Even if you just want to look at it from a preventative health lens, which it doesn't, of course, encompass everything either, but it's amazing that health behaviors are 30% more than clinical care.
Right, thank you. So sorry, Livia, to kind of cut in on your time a little bit, but we still are doing okay with time. So I'm going to turn it over to Livia. And thank you, Dr. Reese, so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be here and represent the CDC in our series.
Oh, I'm honored. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, our honor. Livia?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Dr. Reese. And to everyone, I'm Livia Davis. I consider myself a non-native in this native space. I am from Denmark, so I'm an immigrant, and I am just going to be facilitating a couple of questions that came in the chat box and some reflections. One is around the statistics, and the question is, the statistics that you shared, why isn't Hawaii part of these stats, or is it?
There are US statistics. Hawaii is included.
Okay, so that was one question. So thank you for answering that. And then there was some questions around the first laugh ceremony, and a hope in the chat that you would talk a little bit more about that, if you could, please.
Oh my gosh, of course. So in Navajo culture, when a baby has its first laugh, that's a really important moment to celebrate. And so you have to have this big ceremony to acknowledge the laugh. And the baby, in the picture, you can see there's a basket, and the baby actually takes a bit of salt and will bless the person. Everyone lines up and they'll bless the people coming through. And that notion allows people to keep humor in their lives, as well as be generous. So generosity is a huge part of Navajo culture. And so by offering that, you promote health and wellness and generosity. And the other interesting caveat about that is the person who makes them laugh is the one who has to throw the party. So we always make a joke like, oh, when a baby's around, 3 weeks or so of age, when around that time when they're about to laugh, we want to invite your most wealthy relative over and just have them hold the baby. Then you get a good party.
Thank you. And then just a last one, that was a private question that came into me. Are there data that shows a certain number of the benevolent childhood experiences result in certain outcomes? Is there data around that? Like, so 3 or more, 2 or more, 1 or more?
There's data on the validity of the scale. I think it's a pretty newly introduced scale. So there's lots of work going on right now. Melissa Walls, for one, at Johns Hopkins, is doing some work with this right now that probably will answer that question soon.
Thank you so much. And I think those are the questions. The other ones were answered in the chat box by some of our other faculty. So I very much appreciate it. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Bernice. Thank you.
Sounds good. I don't know if we wanted to add anything else, Holly, before we go ahead and just talk about the survey and the follow-up questions. Is there anything else you would like to address before we move on?
No, I just think that that was a fabulous presentation. Really appreciate your slides, and even the ACE graphic that you used that showed adverse childhood experiences on top, but the roots of adverse community environments at the bottom. You don't often see both of those together on one slide. So really appreciate all that information, Dr. Reese. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.
Sounds good. So if you don't mind filling out our survey, there will be a link sent to you at the end of the presentation. Also within the chat box, we do have that link as well. And if there are any questions, please reach out to any of us here so we can go ahead and get those questions answered to you. Anything, if you have any suggestions or anything else for the upcoming presentations, do that as well. Next slide. And it looks like we're gonna see everybody in September. Hopefully everybody comes back. It'll be the same time on the 4th Tuesday. So our next topic is actually going to be action steps, cultural healing and behavioral health. And that will be September 26, 2023. Next slide. And it looks like we are going to go ahead and end here with our last video that we normally show. Again, please, we feel free to come back next month at the same time, same place, and we will see you all then.
Connor Cheese, another one of my favorites. I just love the way he has his piano on Navajo land and really has some incredible music. Another example of brilliance. So, you know, as we always say when we close out, have a brilliant day. Thanks for joining us. Have a native brilliant day. So there you go. That was wonderful. Those are some awesome slides you had, Dr. Reese. And of course, I saw them before, but to hear you talk about them really brought them to life. And the stories that you shared were just fantastic about your family. And I could just see your dad. Well, I did see him, but I could see him in movement on his horsemanship and his wheeling and dealings that he did. I could just see him walking into a room. It was so vivid for me. Awesome. I tried to catch Dr. Joan Candell, to see if she could stay on for a minute, but she must have jumped off because I know that you all know each other. And she
Oh,
would
yes.
like to say
Yeah.
hello. So any comments from you, Dr. Reese, on how'd you feel about it
No,
all?
I'm just glad I didn't go long. We had some time for questions. I probably should have said the full portion about the cultural piece with the pictures, but it just went a little bit more in depth to the differences between each side of the family. But I think, yeah, I'm glad I finished it with time for questions.
Oh, you did. And you gave me a little bit of time. I did want to really emphasize, you knew, because we talked about before, how important I think the BCE is, the benevolent childhood experience.